Hi, I'm Bill Brown. Welcome to Hindsight. In the mid-1990s, Australian historian Mark McKenna moved to live on some land he'd bought on the southeast coast of New South Wales. While building a house in the bush, opposite a bend of the Toowoomba River known as Blackfellas Point, Mark was inspired to learn more about the people who'd lived on that land before him. He uncovered a story of the Indigenous and non-Indigenous occupants of the land he now calls home. This history of local Aboriginal societies and of the later European settlement of the far south coast of New South Wales reveals the story of colonisation that almost destroyed one culture and civilisation in the process of establishing another. The book that Mark McKenna ultimately wrote, called Looking for Blackfellas Point, has won a number of awards, including the 2003 New South Wales Premier's Literary Awards. In today's feature, Mark McKenna takes us through his own journey of discovery of the history which lay silent for so long within his land. This is a story about the importance of local history, about how several generations of non-Indigenous Australians have learnt to suppress and forget the past, and about the need for not just a locality, but also a nation to acknowledge the truths about the European settlement of this land, to see the shared history between non-Aboriginal and Aboriginal Australians. You'll hear from historian Mark McKenna, writer and fellow South Coast resident Rodney Hall, and also local Aboriginal people, Ossie Cruse, Margaret Dixon, and her son John Dixon.
The book that I imagined writing originally was a book which would have been overflowing with quotes from John Howard and Paul Keating and Geoffrey Blainey and Manning Clark, and it would have been a book about what others had said about history rather than writing history itself. And there was a kind of turning point, or an epiphany really, that's probably what it was. You know, here was I was a historian of Australia, and if I asked myself, well, how much do I know about the Aboriginal past on this place where I'm now building a house, where nothing else has previously been built? I mean, keep that in mind. And so I started to realise, well, I'm very ignorant about this history. And I remember I'd come down one weekend to help Ray with some part of the house, and we were looking across the river, and Ray said to me, "Oh, you know what that point is, don't you, across the river?" And I said, "No, I don't know. You know, what's it called?" And he said, "Oh, well, that's Blackfellas Point." And then it dawned on me that my own ignorance was confronting, really. And then I had to ask myself, well, maybe the best way to write about the politics of Australian history is to start right here, on this ground here, and ask myself and learn and try and understand what was Aboriginal society like before I arrived here, and before Europeans arrived here, and what happened between European settlers and Aboriginal people in this area that I'd now sort of come to belong to. And the title almost rang out when Ray said, "That's Blackfellas Point." And I thought, well, yes, I'm looking for Blackfellas Point.
I'm Ossie Cruse, and I'm a 70-year-old man. I track my roots to the Monero people, to the Kurnow people of Gippsland, and also my grandfather was an American Indian. So we pull all those different people together in my family. And I've been working with Aboriginal affairs for about 35 years, and currently I'm a senior member of our Aboriginal community here at Eden. Some 25 years ago we decided we would do something for our people in way of trying to make a keeping place, a cultural centre, and it started to materialise about 8 years ago. And we're sitting now in a centre that we call the Uluru Gadu. In Aboriginal it simply means peoples of the mountains and the sea. Prior to settlement, or prior to the man in the crooked hat coming, named Captain Cook, there would have been a mixture of our people here. There would have been the Bidawal, the Kurnai, the Tarawa people. There would have been the Narago people from Monero. people had an attitude towards the specific people, and that was our people. Therefore, they could do these things that they did do. I worked for a beautiful person by the name of Rich Williams in the North Coast. He was about 90 years of age. And I remember him telling me stories of his experience as a boy over in West Australia, where they would saddle up horses and they would go for the Sunday picnic, and they would see how many bungs they could shoot in that day, and that would be their prize. They'd get the best prize for the number of the people that they killed on the land. Now, when you think about that, that's a horrible attitude to have, but really they didn't think they were killing another person. It was some half man, half ape creature.
It's clear that from the 1790s, which is a matter of only 3 or 4 years after the colony begins in Sydney, that Twofold Bay and the far south coast were part of a strip of coastline stretching all the way down to Tasmania that Europeans and Americans, by the way, used as a sort of site for sealing. And so the first contact was with the sealers. And the sealers were, for a start, they were multinational. I mean, you had Hawaiians and South Sea Islanders working on these boats. You had Americans, French, English, continental Europeans. So it's a very, very broad ethnic mix. Often these people were uneducated, fairly rough in character. That was the lifestyle they were leading on the sea. You could probably think of them as the kind of lawless vanguard of European imperialism, really, beyond anyone's control, left to their own designs. I mean, imagine them being here with their boat after the seals and coming into contact with Aboriginal people. The local stories in Twofold Bay around sealing are pretty grim reading. And in fact, they're not just stories in oral culture, they're on the pages of the Sydney Gazette. I mean, if you go to any library and pull up the Sydney Gazette in the first decade of the 19th century, you'll find stories of contact between, inverted commas, the wild natives of Twofold Bay and sealing vessels that were passing through here. So there are stories, for example, of Europeans hanging the dead bodies of Aboriginal people in trees. There were sealers that were killed as well, of course. But of course, reprisals were, as always, brutal and swift with a gun. There was a reputation in Sydney that the Twofold Bay Aboriginal people were extremely hostile. And that reputation was there until the 1820s. And that hostility, in the eyes of the Europeans, to me says these were people who were aware that they didn't want to give their land away, or they were aware that the sight of this vessel and these people could bring about the destruction of their society. It's astonishing when you realise that the history of this area begins in the 1830s. In other words, when people begin to write history, when they begin in the first generation, say in the 1840s and 50s, when they're starting to create their own history, it begins with the coming of the first pioneers, inverted commas, the Imlays and the Boyds and so on in the 1840s and 1830s. It doesn't begin with the sealers. And so you've got this whole period of 20 to 30 years which is almost entirely forgotten. And when you're thinking about how does a culture of forgetting begin, well, here's a really good example of how it begins. You can think of the difficulties that contact with sealers brought. Any number of diseases to which Aborigines didn't have immunity, and the violence.
What happened back there when the man in the crooked hat came ashore and took possession of this land. He had a mandate from the King of England and from the Crown. He was supposed to negotiate with other people that were in these areas, supposed to at least talk with them and have some sort of invitation to access the area. But he did it through a way that is reflected to us today, whereby he chose to say, well, because they didn't build roads, they didn't make fences, they didn't plough the ground, that the land wasn't used, and therefore we could say it was vacant and empty.
It's hard to judge other nations, but I don't know of another nation that is so reluctant to accept the kind of proven reality of its own past. We have what we've got because we took it. I'm Rodney Hall, I write books, and I live on a very beautiful piece of coastal land in southern New South Wales. And I suppose all my books, or nearly all of them, have been concerned in one way or another with this issue. This issue about what it is to be Australian in Australia. But I mean, I've been involved in Aboriginal rights organisations since I was 17 in Brisbane, when it was very unfashionable and you got kind of phone tapped and police standovers and, yeah, nasty business. Queensland in the 50s. Not a good idea. We've always known what the situation was. We've always known they were driven off their own land. We've always known that they died in large numbers. I mean, when Henry Reynolds, wonderful man as he is, and they're the best books we have on, in my view, on Aboriginal history, his book called Why Weren't We Told? As I said to Henry over breakfast once, it's the wrong title, Henry. It should be Why Didn't We Listen? Because we've always known.
I'm walking along the top of the Midden on the southern side of Twofold Bay and looking across to where the Toowoomba River comes out to sea. The same water that moves past my place, now moving out towards the sea. And behind me is Davidson's whaling station, and above me are grey box and some ribbon gum which would predate European settlement, some of them 300-400 years old. Even by the time that Boyd and Brierly and the Imlays arrive in Twofold Bay, right, 1830s, 1840s, you have the first so-called settlement here. Yet already by that stage, the enormous dislocation of Aboriginal society was almost to the point of being irretrievable, even within 5 or 6 years of their arrival. And that wasn't just because of what had happened through their own hands, but of course it was what had happened with the sealers beforehand and the squatters in the hinterland. So that tells us how Aboriginal societies, for so many different reasons, struggled to cope with the influx of Europeans. And it shows us that, like for example, there are stories at Twofold Bay of tribes from the Monaro, tribes from northern Victoria, north of Twofold Bay to Bega, coming down, and people from all around being present and living permanently at Twofold Bay, around the boiling down works here at Twofold Bay that the Imlays had. Now, of course, Aboriginal people constantly did move in those directions anyway. That wasn't unusual. But what was unusual is that you began to see this emergence of the classic, fringe dwelling situation where groups of people would permanently reside. You can see the evidence when you look at the historical record that by the 1840s and 50s, there are very few speakers left even of the Twofold Bay language. Very few.
Their language was inseparable from the experience of the land around them. When Pastor Strello, the elder Pastor Strello, started the first dictionary of any Aboriginal language, in the Arrernte language in Central Australia, around Ayers Rock area, and he said to the elders, "How much have I got?" And they said, "Oh, well, you've got probably about half." Because, of course, there was no separating the words from the ceremonies that went with the words, so there were certain things he could never know because he was not born into it. So by their estimate, their language was perhaps 400,000 words long. And that very same year, the first Murray's Oxford Dictionary was published in 21 volumes, the big Oxford Dictionary, and the English language itself had 400,000 words. So the idea that somebody can carry in their own head every single word, knowing its meaning and its application in a language like English, for example. I mean, we were dealing with the most amazingly sophisticated minds.
We didn't have written records, other than we did have, message sticks, and we did have the paintings and etchings on the walls of caves and on rocks that told a lot of history and a lot of things that were passed on from our older people that we are now. And most things were taught by verbal. The things that we talk about, the dreaming and those things like that, they were like parables, more or less, that taught us quality of life and taught us respect for environment and for each other, and how that we should manage ourselves.
Because European culture was so totally materialist, they were looking for objects, and they found very few, and those they thought pretty primitive compared to Europe. So they were. They weren't seeing a culture because they didn't see, A, the miracle of survival in parts of this country, and survival in a way that didn't damage the place, but B, they didn't, they had no comprehension that linguistically these people were dealing at an extremely sophisticated level.
One of the big, finds for me was going to the Mitchell Library and finding Brierly's diaries and journals. And of course, Brierly was a young painter who accompanied Ben Boyd out to Australia in 1842 and came to Twofold Bay basically to work for Boyd and to set up his business in Twofold Bay. And he kept a journal as he travelled from Twofold Bay on horseback with Ben Boyd and an Aboriginal guide, Toby, coming up the river, passing right where we're sitting now, on the way up to the Monaro to view some of Boyd's properties, which he'd just sort of purchased like postage stamps, thousands and thousands of acres. So they came past this point in Christmas at 1843. And when I first discovered Brierly's journal in the library, it was just such a moment, because he'd sketched points just up from where we're sitting. He'd sketched points on the river, and you could see in some of these sketches how Aboriginal people had worked the landscape, they'd fired it, and they'd created open areas for hunting and so on. And you could see the majestic trees as well in the sketches along the riverbank. I've probably identified with Brierly in a way, because Brierly, I suppose, he comes here in his 20s, a young man, and he's still curious. He's very curious about Aboriginal culture. Unlike someone like George Imlay, who sits alone in his bush hut at Twofold Bay, declining his French verbs, Brierly is out there sketching and painting and talking with Aboriginal people and developing friendships. So in the book, of course, there's a chapter on Oswald Brierly and his time at Twofold Bay between 1842 and 1848. And I've often imagined standing on the veranda. I would have, if I could have stood on that very point in Christmas 1843, I would have seen Boyd and Brierly and Toby passing by on horseback. There's this wonderful scene where Brierly is sitting on the sand with Toby, and Toby's trying to teach Brierly some of his language. So he would say a word and then Brierly would try and copy him, and of course not succeed very, very well. And then Toby would be jumping up and down laughing at Brierly's poor attempt to manage Aboriginal language. And so at one point Toby actually would break the words down into 3 or 4 different syllables and then get Brierly to say one syllable at a time. And then he was overjoyed when Brierly finally did manage to get it right. It's these basic human encounters that I think have become especially lost in our past. Not only the forgetting of the violent encounters, but also the forgetting of the stories of human curiosity, fun, enjoyment. There's a wonderful story that I came across very early period, 1797, at Asling's Beach, which is just on the other side, the north side of Eden. And Matthew Flinders arrived and walked over the headland towards Asling's Beach to take some measurements. And he was followed all the way by an Aboriginal man. And no doubt the Aboriginal man was very curious to see what Flinders was up to. Anyway, they followed him all the way down to the beach. So Flinders starts setting up his instruments on the beach, and the Aboriginal man walks up to him and offers him a piece of whale fat. And Flinders, in typically polite English fashion, accepts the gift, takes it, and thought, what can I give this man in return? So he gives him one of those terribly hard biscuits that's no doubt been on the boat for a few months at least, and hands it to the Aboriginal man. And I guess there must have been a period where they both stood looking at one another. Well, I suppose it's necessary, we better eat this now. So they both at the same time, Flinders starts to eat the whale meat and the Aboriginal man starts to eat the biscuit. And they both had this incredible revulsion of, oh, this is terrible. I mean, they both found what they were eating obnoxious. And because they were both too polite to show the other, lest they offend the other person, Matthew Flinders catches sight just at the moment that he's trying to spit the whale meat out when he thought the Aboriginal man wasn't looking. The Aboriginal man is spitting the biscuit out too at the same time.
In all the earth, you couldn't have found two cultures more incompatible than the arrival of the British on the shores of this country. They had no way of understanding each other. None at all.
Baron Charles von Hugel was an Austrian diplomat who came out to Twofold Bay in the late 1830s. He's so interesting because he's not English, and he's got a much more critical eye on English colonialism, and because of that detachment, his observations are really quite valuable. There was a really wonderful passage in von Hugel's journals where he talks about the scene that he encountered, and he just met Imlay in his hut. And remember that I said, Imlay spent a lot of his time in his hut at night declining his French verbs. And so you get this image of a person who was very much in exile. And von Hugel was astonished at the crudity of the interior of Imlay's hut. And then around the shoreline of the bay, there were carcasses of bullocks and whales hanging on large hooks. And you could smell the rotting and burning flesh in the air. You could smell the flesh burning. It's a sense of extracting from this environment what can be boiled down, if you like, to the almighty dollar. And there is a sense that that was the main purpose in the early days of a lot of the activity that was going on around Twofold Bay.
I always think, to explain history, look where the money is.
How did we come to forget? What were the origins of our forgetting of the frontier history encounter, and also our forgetting of Aboriginal people themselves? From the very beginning, you had to have an explanation about what happened to Aboriginal people. On the south coast of New South Wales, some of the different ways were quite fascinating. First off, it was common when I was doing my research for the book to encounter people saying to me in non-Aboriginal oral history, saying, look, there weren't many original inhabitants at the time. The other way they would forget what happened would be to say, well, yes, some violence did occur, but it was usually the lower classes who were responsible. It was usually the convicts or people who were uneducated. It wasn't the better people, they weren't responsible. Often the stories went along the lines of, yes, there was violence, but it was insignificant, it was minor, it was peripheral, it wasn't characteristic of the whole nature of contact. Yet if you look at the language closely, that I found anyway in some of the newspaper articles, it was clear that the initial wave of squatters and settlers in southeastern New South Wales, violent encounters were common, not uncommon, but common. One of the other really interesting ways of explaining away Aboriginal people was to say that they actually wiped one another out in tribal warfare. And that's used as a way of saying, well, if they wiped one another out in that battle, well, we couldn't have wiped any of them out. It's the way the story functions in non-Aboriginal culture that's really interesting and quite disturbing too. There were other strategies, like saying that Aboriginal people died in natural disasters. And in a way, when you have these stories they become myths for the destruction of Aboriginal society. They admit violence, but they really disguise a lot of the way in which that violence occurred. One of the most common ways of forgetting what happened on the South Coast was to say, well, yep, look, violence occurred in Victoria, it occurred in Western New South Wales, it occurred in Queensland, but on the South Coast of New South Wales, there was no violence. In other words, everywhere else but here. Everywhere else but here. This is a common strategy as well.
For me, it's only like the time of my grandfather's birth, so none of it's that long ago. That's why I think the family thing is actually important, that people have hung on to loyalties, and that plus the kind of excitement and sheer hard work of the pioneer period, where enormously hard work, but liberating work. And the early 19th century cities, the Industrial Revolution cities, are just mind-blowing, mind-numbingly hideous. And you think people came out of these hideous environments, so polluted and cramped. To be land in the bush, yes, it's hard work, but boy, was it a liberating thing. So they don't want to be told that the land they move on to, that they've got a title to from their own government, actually belonged to someone else, only just, a matter of a few years earlier, who were never compensated, who were never consulted, who were never asked. Nobody declared war on them, wasn't taken by an army. There was no kind of way of assimilating it except to say it was individuals, hard-working pioneer individuals, who actually took the land and defended what they took, as we know they did, with firearms, that they defended what they took. But they didn't see themselves as invading. They saw themselves as settling and defending what they'd settled. But everybody knew, and I think that guilt has burrowed in deep.
They created attitudes that we experienced as a people growing up, and we wouldn't allow those attitudes to overcome us. All our family, my family, my mother had them in the Aboriginal section of the hospital. They would not mix the linen, they had the linens branded, and all the things were branded that they wouldn't mix with the white people because they were contaminated. They were from blacks, and in fact, they had in big letters ABO written on them. And every day, you had this strange experience to say that you weren't a part of this society. For instance, as a kid, I remember in a shop, if you were waiting to be served, you would be the last to be served, and even if people came in after, while you were still standing, they'd serve those people if they weren't Aboriginal. And so you got into this idea that you would have to wait for other people to be served in shops. In fact, there were shops that wouldn't serve you, and I've been one of those people who had that incredible experience of being told that they don't serve me because I'm an Aboriginal. That people had to apply for what they call citizens' rights. They would get a little card that gave them all the rights of the ordinary citizen, and that was a strange thing because, here we are in our own land, but still had to apply to be a citizen of this country. I can remember driving to one town that we know well, Maruya, in fact. The policeman come up and met Dad we were in this old 21-inch wheel vehicle, the old-time canvas wood, and the policeman pulled us up on the outskirts of town and said, "Where are you going? Who are you?" And he said, "We're going to Maruya." And the policeman said, "All right, and how long are you going to be in there?" And Dad said, "Well, I've got me sleeper pass, I've got my money, and we're going to do shopping." And the policeman said, "Well, sundown and out." And Dad, with that, said to him, "Well," and I remember Dad shouting, he said, "I'm going to be in there, I'm going to do my shopping, and I'll be after the sun, and you come and put me out." I saw these things. I saw the times that we went into picture theatres and Aboriginal people weren't allowed to sit among white people, that they'd sit right down the front where they were cordoned off and there was a roped area for Aboriginal people to sit. I saw it happening in schools where European people were given a preference in education and Aboriginal people were just treated as though they would never have an education or never amount to much. There were laws in those days saying that Aboriginal people should not handle foodstuffs because they were unhygienic in their domestic duties. They took all our bones of our people to examine them, and we're trying to get them back. And they even took heads and parts of the body of Aboriginal people, finding out if they were the missing link. And so that the atrocities that Mark talks about were done in that same attitude, that they weren't really killing a fully developed human being, but this half man, half animal creature, and the animals of this land they brought in here, the sheep and cattle, were more valuable than that person.
My name is Margaret Dixon, nee Mundy, Derringarns tribe and Ngarigo tribe. Well, my father was a Ngarigo man from up in the mountains, Delicate. He was born at Delicate. And before they went to Delegate, they were at Wallandibby and then a place called Currawong. And then they were moved on to the reserve at Delegate. And then he came down the mountain and met my mother down here, who was a Derringarns woman. And then they went to Nara, and when they went to Nara, I was born in Nara. On the Shoalhaven River, where I grew up there. And I went to a little school called Torres School. There was a few Aboriginal children that went to a place called Wurrigi Lane, where a lot of our people used to live. And some of them were sort of living in little break winds and tin huts, go out to tip and get pieces of tin. And another place called Brown's Flats, where they had no homes there, so they went to carry tin from the Nara tip and built all these tin huts, tin shacks and that. And, they went out there and tried to tell them to move on from Brown's Flats, but they wasn't reckoning on who the owner was. He was the butcher from there. His name was Radcliffe, Mr. Radcliffe. He owned the land, and he went out there and told him they had to go and leave the Aboriginal people alone because it was his land. So they lived there for years and years, and they ended up putting new houses there for them. Trying to put them back on the missions. One didn't want to go back on missions. They didn't want to go. My mum and dad didn't want to go because my dad had plenty of work, and then he was just lucky that he went down to a place called Torres, where there was two families who owned two big market gardens, and they both gave him a job, so he worked the two market gardens. And they ended up giving us our house on the riverbank, and that's where I went to school there, Torres. Well, we had plenty of vegetables to eat, and yeah. So we sort of lived a good life there. My little brother and sister, Brother Claude and Sister Beryl, the protection board still come along and took them. Couldn't do anything. Couldn't do a thing. I couldn't understand why they took them when Mum and Dad was working. We had plenty to eat. It was just, we was living there in the market garden, just outside of our door, with all the vegetables. And just down the road we'd go, every morning I'd be going down and getting a big can of milk, before I went to school. And my dad was working. My mother was working for the undertaker in Nara. They were both hard-working people, yet they still come along and took brother and sister. They were just going picking the kids up. A lot of the kids were running for the bush, hiding. A place called Wurrigi. They used to go and hide in the bush, so when they'd hear a car coming, and that Brown's Flats, as soon as the kids would see a car pulling up or coming in the gate, away they'd go through the bush in the tea trees. And my family just went to pieces. After that, then my dad moved back home down this brought us back home to Bega, and where we got a job, and we had a whole house down around in Chile there. And when my brother came home when he was young, he was about probably 16 or 17, sent him home. And then my sister, I've never seen her for years, so she was sent out to Yass. She's still out there today. Somehow fella took me out there to see my sister. But when I went out to see her, it was like talking to a stranger. Couldn't get her to talk or anything, so I just left there in tears. And I come home. I haven't seen her since. She wouldn't talk. I don't know what happened to her, you know. And she was taken.
A culture of forgetting. That carries even through to the 1960s. I mean, if for example, you were to say to some people in Bega today that there was an enormous debate about the idea of housing just a few Aboriginal families in the centre of Bega in the 1960s, many people won't be aware of that history. They're struck by the fact that only 30 or 40 years ago there was an upsurge of racism about the idea of black Australians living right next door to white Australians.
The Bega Valley Aboriginal Advancement Association was formed with Margaret, Dixon and Reverend Frank Woodwell. Senior people in the town were interested in doing something for Aboriginal people. And that happened around about 1965 or 66, somewhere about that period. The Anglican Church was going to give a big parcel of land to the Department of Housing for housing purposes. And out of that they would have to build one house for Margaret Dixon. Well, that's all recorded in history. And but the hullabaloo, the outcry of Aboriginal people coming into town was incredible, unbelievable.
And Woodwell went to the street one morning and found that someone had taken down the sign Howard Avenue and put up instead the sign Coon Avenue.
Coon Avenue. So you can imagine how they, what they thought. Probably, you know, don't like Aboriginals to have things, I suppose. We have a good roof over our head and things like that. I suppose they think we're not supposed to have anything. Well, you know, why did they put up Coon Avenue? It was just racist. It didn't make them feel good. No. A bit scared as well. Well, you know, people that put things out like that, you never know what they'll do. You know, I was living on my traditional lands.
I was thinking about how old stories are, and I thought, well, let's say that Moses, the Old Testament books about Moses, let's agree they're an old story. That's just over 3,000 years ago. They would have had storytellers here on this land at the same time as Moses. And their Moses would have had stories going to a Moses before. If you take that length, that 3,000-year span, you have to fold it back 20 times before you get to a point where there were no Aboriginal people here. I mean, how long do you have to be somewhere to be thought to be owning it? I mean, it's just... But how amazing that the government can get away with that gobbledygook, that we acknowledge Aboriginal prior occupation, they were custodians of the land. They were owners of that. I mean, when our own leaders can't deal with it, it's no wonder the public can't deal with it. And then the scare tactic, I mean, the way the government keeps this lie alive was to say that they're going to be after your backyard. And anyone who looked at that, the whole thing that arose out of Wick, can see that that was never the case.
Funny enough, it actually made us stronger and made us want to say, well, They think we're like this, but we're not. We're better than this. And we've come a long way since Coon Avenue. And we don't live on Coon Avenue, we never have. We are the people who can tell the stories about this great land. I'm John Dixon. I take my mother's side, that's as Aboriginal people do. We come from the Dirrangarja and the Garrigo people. We just want to get on and live our lives and enjoy our family, our country, and our beliefs and our traditional ways. So, you know, it wouldn't hurt to say sorry and pay a bit more respect and to recognise the wrongs and try to right them.
We went through a brief period between 1988 at the time of the bicentenary and the late 1990s, say 1997 with the release of the Stolen Generations report, where for the first time in our history, with Mabo, with the bicentenary and with the Stolen Generations, the Aboriginal voice was visible and it was at the centre of our political and national life. In Bega, for example, we had 400 to 500 people meeting in public and watching the videos that were released by the Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission. We had extraordinary stories of Aboriginal people standing up and giving testaments, telling their life story, if you like, and non-Aboriginal people just sitting and listening in silence. And at the same time, you've got a debate going on in the local council about whether there should or should not be a formal motion of apology passed by the Bega Valley Council. You had at the time a council that was riddled with allegations of corruption and mismanagement on a whole raft of issues. So there wasn't a strong degree of confidence in the council at the time, even before this issue arose. You had an old guard on the council who were probably pretty representative of many of the attitudes in the 60s and 70s towards Aboriginal people. And you had councillors who were trying to bring in this new politics and pushing the motion for an apology very, very strongly. The council refused to apologise and the council chambers were graffitied with the word shame, shame, shame. And this was photographed and put in the local paper. And I guess I saw that, you know, if you think about the Coon Avenue story, 30 years before that you had the sign Coon Avenue put up in the one street where Aboriginal people were going to be housed, and now the graffiti was turning the opposite direction. Now it was shame, shame, shame on the council for not having the guts and the courage to apologise to Aboriginal people. There was one particularly moving council meeting where Margaret Dixon was in attendance and was photographed leaving the council in tears because they refused to apologise. And this was around the time that the public meetings were taking place, you know, where there were quite a lot of moving testimonies from Aboriginal people that appeared in full in the paper as well. It showed in a very, very real way how important the word reconciliation was to, I suppose, not, you know, of course to Aboriginal people, but even more so in a different way to non-Aboriginal people. And when the council is finally sacked, it's important not to give the impression that the council was sacked because it didn't apologise to Aboriginal people. It was sacked for a whole raft of other issues that the government in Sydney no longer had confidence in the council's ability, so they appointed an administrator. And one of his first actions was to pass a motion of sorrow and regret. And yes, the words sorrow and regret are crucial because the missing word's apology. And I think we can all remember at the time that John Howard was making his case as to why he would not apologise as Prime Minister. And his case was that I can't apologise for actions for which I personally am not responsible.
There was an amazing philosopher in Italy in the early 18th century by the name of Vico, who was the first historiographer, and he had a great phrase. He said in that wonderful book of his, The New Science, he said, if we knowingly tamper with any fact from the past, we corrupt the present and disable ourselves from dealing with the future. And that's what I think we're doing. We're disabling ourselves from dealing with the future because we're not facing the truth we know to be the truth in our own past. So I think the greatest beneficiaries of us saying sorry and actually acknowledging as individual Australians that this is the background of our own history. Not until we do that are we going to liberate ourselves. So I think we would be the greatest beneficiaries of not only saying sorry properly, but actually saying, okay, I do accept this is the origins of us being in this land.
People are aware that the Aboriginal children were taken away from their parents, but the other thing that really sticks out that people haven't been focusing on is that the old people, our Aboriginal elders, were being taken away, and they were being placed in institutions like the Kenmore mental institution out at Goulburn, and they were being written off as mental patients or insane. We had old people living on the river, and they were really traditional people. They knew the language, they had all the traditional lifestyle, living on the riverbanks, spearing their fish and hunting in the swamps. But with them old people passing and, you know, the traditional ways not being allowed to be passed on, with the old people being taken away and the children being taken away, and the mission managers not allowing traditional language to be practiced or traditional dances on the missions like Wallaga Lake. It all made a terrible big cocktail which accounted in today Aboriginal people who are on their traditional lands and who don't know their traditional language and don't practice their traditional ways.
Right now is a time ripe for us to start looking at reconciliation and putting all that stuff behind us, and we'll find ways and means of doing that. On a community level, we can reconcile. We can reconcile with people because we are, at that level, people, and we can make a reconciliation. But the government really has to deal with this thing that they're doing from a top level that's destroying us as a people. And unless they deal with that, we will never have reconciliation at that level in this country.
I don't see why the Republic shouldn't be that catalyst. In the excitement of creating the new Australian Republic, then I think we can do it. Then in that process, we can say, this is where we came from, this is how we got the land.
The two social movements and symbolic political movements that dominated Australian politics in the 1990s were clearly the Republic and reconciliation. And yet, it was clear that at least from the early 90s, from say 1993-4, that those two issues were seen by the Keating government as entirely separate, that they weren't to be related. I mean, I'm someone who's worked on the Republic for many years, on the history of republicanism in Australia, and I even wrote a book myself about the history of republicanism, which also in a way I guess was symptomatic of that, you know, accepting the separation of the two issues. That republicanism and Aboriginal history were two separate stories, if you like. I guess through writing, looking for Blackfellas Point, I came to see that it was impossible to imagine or to found a republic without addressing the issue of reconciliation. And the reason for that is so simple that I almost kicked myself for not having seen it before. The point is this: to become a republic, we have to remove the sovereignty of the Crown. We all accept that. If we're to install the so-called Australian head of state, we must remove the sovereignty of the Crown from our Constitution. So, okay, if we remove the sovereignty of the Crown, surely we have to say something about the sovereignty that the Crown usurped. How can we remove the lie that this land is Crown land How can we remove that sovereignty and then do so without acknowledging the Aboriginal prior occupation and ownership of this continent by Aboriginal people?
You know, I go back to good old Vico 250 years ago. You know, if you don't know who you are and you start telling lies about where you came from or how you came to be here, then you're not going to be in good shape to deal with the future. It's deeply important to people. To all of us, we tend to define what we mean by the search for the truth we're looking for, whether it's a truth in a relationship or, you know, whatever the variety of truth is. But I think in all of us, we know that we're lost without it. We actually have to know what that truth is that we're asking. Nobody lives with their history, no nation on earth. Every nation lives with stories they tell out of their history. But we've missed the big story. We've selectively told those stories and ignored the others. It's just something as simple as that we accept that in 1788 a civilian invasion began in this country that took the land off Aboriginal people. Let's just say, I understand that is what I'm the inheritor of. Even if I only came 10 years ago from Bosnia or 10 years ago from Argentina or something, I understand that's how we have the society we've got in Australia. That's why we're like we are, why we've got the freedoms we've got. But, you know, my view of that is that it's for them to feel they can reconcile with us, not for us to. I think it's too easy for us to say, I'm going to make a statement saying, I feel reconciled with the Aboriginal people. I think we have to say sorry first, thank you afterwards, and leave it to them, because it's for them to offer us. That's a gift of grace if they want to offer it. It's not something, we're not in a position to give a gift of grace. We've taken too much.
Reconciliation always has meant to me peace. It means peace, and it means something that would leave a better legacy for our children. I don't ever wish that my children ever went through, or children's children, I'm a great-grandfather now, that they would never have to go through the things that we went through, which were, as I mentioned so many times, you know, out of misunderstanding and having a stereotype idea of what Aboriginal people were.
To me personally, I think just heave a huge sigh and say, well, at long last, and how easy was that?
It would make me feel more pride in being Australian. It matters to me personally because it's about truth and the telling of truth and acknowledging history and acknowledging the depth of the importance of the Aboriginal story in Australia. But it also matters as a beacon. It matters for the direction that it points to for Australia.
I'd feel like a proud Aboriginal Australian, and I'd be proud of all Australians.
Special thanks to Mark McKenna, Rodney Hall, Margaret Dixon, John Dixon and Ossie Cruse, and to all those who contributed to this Hindsight feature. Technical producer was Trevor John. Additional sound recording by Jake Brown. I'm Bill Brown, and you've been with Hindsight on ABC Radio National.